I thought I'd try and talk maybe a little bit about how you try and translate the kind of vision that Andrew's just set out with such clarity, and which just makes such sense. How do you try and put that into the mad world that we live in? How does someone who believes all of that, as I passionately do, how do you begin to try to introduce that way of thinking into Westminster? Andrew was talking about the importance of the date 2016, and I absolutely think that's right. And that means that the next 5 years, literally, are really going to make more difference, potentially, have the potential to make more difference than almost any other small period that we've been through in history before. And that's an amazing responsibility, but it's also a fairly awesome opportunity in a sense as well. I mean, it does mean that it falls down to your generation now to be doing some pretty important things over the next few years, and it certainly falls on this Parliament to be doing things very differently in a very short amount of time, because essentially if we don't get emissions to peak and start coming down in a very small window of opportunity that we have, then the chances of getting off the collision course that we're on with climate change diminish seriously. I mean, it's going to be that much more difficult to tackle climate change if we don't make the reductions in our emissions now. And you speak to government advisors and to other politicians, and they say, oh, don't worry, when we've sorted out the economic crisis, we'll have enough money and we'll have enough time to get around to worrying about the environmental crisis. And there is no understanding that the environment crisis doesn't sit on the sidelines twiddling its fingers while we worry about, what by comparison is a much smaller problem. The environmental crisis is getting worse all the time, and the critical thing is that what matters is the cumulative amount of emissions in the atmosphere. In other words, it doesn't work to say, we'll just let a few more emissions go up for the next 5-10 years while we sort out the economics, and then we'll come back to working on climate change. It doesn't work, because by that time, the cumulative impact of those emissions in the atmosphere are that much greater, and therefore the challenge of addressing it is that much greater too, and the chances of passing these so-called tipping points are very much higher. And that sense that Andrew gave, of being one MP among 649 others, I'm quite used to votes 649 in favour and one against, but nevertheless, that voice is important. But I mean, I do feel that pressure. I feel it immensely, because in my head is that sense that time is running out, that urgency is of the essence. And if there's one thing that politicians don't seem to get, is that sense of urgency. They might be able to look at the next few years, but they don't get the idea that we really need such a step change in the way that we're doing things. And the thing that I sort of hear in my head is that film, The Age of Stupid. I'm sure many of you will have seen it. It's a film about some kind of catastrophe. We assume it's climate change, and you've got Pete Postlethwaite in 2050 as the sole survivor of some kind of climate catastrophe. And he looks back in 2050, back to now, back to today, and he says in words that still make the hairs on the back of my neck go up when I say it. He says, why is it, knowing that what we knew then, did we not act when we still had time? And that is the question that I just think needs to be rattled in everybody's window and shouted in every high street, and just saying, guys, what else do we need? If you look at all of the figures that are coming out of the scientific community, if you look what's happening in nature today, we don't need much more evidence of the fact that we need to change the way we live very fast. And there is that sense that there is plenty of data out there. The issue is the political will to address it. I think that the big question is, whether we're going to go down in history as the species that spent all of its time monitoring its own extinction with all of this data, or whether we're actually going to take some urgent steps to try to avoid it. And I'll do my negative bit first, and then I'll come around to the positive bit. But my negative bit as well is that this famous figure of the 2 degrees, that as long as we keep warming below 2 degrees, we'll be fine, is well out of date if you talk to some of the latest scientists, for example, Kevin Anderson at the Tyndall Centre, whom Andrew met and mentioned. Because 2 degrees is no longer, if it ever was, the distinction between acceptable climate change, manageable climate change, and dangerous climate change. As Kevin Anderson said very powerfully just a few weeks ago, it's the difference between dangerous climate change and extraordinarily dangerous climate change. If you look at the pledges that were made at the Cancun Climate Summit, the most recent climate summit, where countries got together and did at least make some pledges to reduce their emissions, if you add up what they all pledged, and let's not assume that they will all do what they pledge, there's unfortunately not a very good track record of people even doing what they do pledge, but let's assume that they're right, let's assume that they'll do what they pledge. If you add up all of those pledges, it still puts us on course for a 4-degree rise by the end of this century. And that's looking at existing political will, if you like, that's what we're headed for, which is a terrifying thought. And so that, what comes back for me really is this issue of the urgency, of the importance of the next few years literally, and how we begin to get this kind of thinking that Andrew's been setting out so clearly into places where it matters. And how we bring about change. I mean, that to me is almost the most important point, you know, and I think that change will come about as a combination, mostly actually, of people on the streets and grassroots movements and popular movements demanding change, but hopefully also because there are at least a few people in political spaces, MPs and others, who will work with the extra parliamentary activity, if you like, and hopefully that pincer movement can begin to make some kind of change possible. But if you just look at what we're going through just now, as I say, the environment is completely off the agenda. Everything is about the economic crisis. And we've got George Osborne's budget for growth, as he very proudly calls it, that we're going to have a week on Thursday. And everybody is vying for the best strategy to get more and more growth. And the voices that are actually saying, is that the right question, are very few. There's a lovely bit from my favourite programme, West Wing. I love the West Wing. And Leo McGarry was the vice presidential candidate. And he's told by his advisers ahead of facing a particularly savage press corps to never accept the premise of the question. And I just could not underline that more strongly in terms of the kind of debates that are going on in political spheres at the moment, because, you know, the premise of the question, we need more and more growth, which is basically about kickstarting the economy, getting it back to business as usual as quickly as possible. You know, do people not learn anything? It is precisely business as usual, indiscriminate growth without any thought about whether it's doing good things or bad things, whether it's Andrew's lovely walk in the Downs or whether it's bunging his drains. That attitude to growth is precisely one of the things that has got us into the crisis that we face today. And so one of my challenges in the budget discussions, and I think I'm going to be on Question Time that same night, will be how to begin to talk about this stuff in a way that isn't dismissed as complete heresy, stupidity, lunacy, but actually to point out that our reality is grounded in an awful lot more real basis, if you like, than the kind of fantasy economics that they're going to be talking about. And these challenges are there all the time. Another big debate that's going on at the moment, of course, is about the increase in fuel prices. And again, you've got government trying to talk about, well, shall we try and have a stabiliser, or at least we try and put off the 1p fuel increase that was due in April. And you have to be quite a brave politician, actually, to get up and say, well, in fact, we think, on balance, we need to have a fuel escalator. There needs to be a constant sign that prices of fuel is going to go up, because it's not only as a result of the geopolitical crisis and events in the Middle East and North Africa at the moment. The reason that oil prices are going up is also for geological reasons. In other words, concerns around peak oil, the fact that resources are dwindling, and that we can argue when we're going to meet the actual point of peak oil, but there can be no argument that at some point we will get to the area where there is, you know, that we've passed the peak of total oil reserves, and therefore the cost of extracting more oil is going to go up constantly in that upward trajectory. Now, the real challenge, I think, is how we address those issues, but to do it in a progressive way, because the Green Party stands for environmental justice, but it also stands for social justice. And it is true that people are going to be very hard hit by more increasing oil prices, particularly since the government hasn't put in place, not just this government, but no governments have put in place a sensible alternative transport system whereby, for example, people can leave their cars behind in rural areas and still know that they can get back after a meeting at 9 o'clock at night because the last bus didn't stop at 6 o'clock or whatever. So we need to have those public transport alternatives that are much more affordable, reliable, good. You know, they manage it in the rest of Europe. I don't quite know why it's such a problem here. So we need that, but we also need other policies. And one of our policies that we'd be talking about when it comes to the budget would be to be challenging and asking to reverse the increase in the VAT that's just gone up, as you'll know, from 17.5% to 20%, and that's having a much bigger impact actually on fuel prices than the fuel escalator would. But at least the fuel escalator gives you certainty, it allows businesses to be able to plan into the future, and hopefully gives a signal then to successive governments that it's worth investing in the alternative public transport infrastructure that we're going to need, whereas simply caving into public pressure, which is probably what this government is going to do, will do very little. VAT is a very regressive tax. In other words, it hits the poorest hardest because it's a constant amount that isn't related to how much you earn. If we were to get rid of that VAT increase, I think that would do an awful lot more to help people who are really struggling, and it wouldn't be a negative environmental sign, as scrapping the fuel escalator certainly would be. I suppose that the thing that maybe that I would like to get across is that in terms of the challenges of communicating all of this, because I think that is the big thing, really, is about how we do try to inject this kind of perspective into day-to-day political debates. I think it is about trying to challenge the idea that this message is all about hair shirts, it's all about shivering around a candle in a cave, and it's all pretty miserable. You know, I've been on so many radio programmes where the first kind of question is something like, oh, okay, you're from the Green Party, what do you want us to give up now? You know, and there's just this assumption that we're going to be in there being really miserable and telling them whatever they're doing is wrong. And that hasn't helped the Green message at all, I don't think, and anybody in the Green movement. And I think as a whole, the Green movement hasn't been as good as it should be and could have been about painting a much more vibrant picture of what a zero economy would look like, a zero economy society would look like. You know, we're so busy saying to people, if you don't act, it's all going to be dreadful, that we forget that actually probably a better motivating way of talking to people is actually about saying, look, the changes that we need in order to address climate change, in order to address the other environmental problems that are contingent upon the fact that we are basically consuming far more than we can sustainably afford to do, addressing those problems are likely to improve our quality of life as a whole as well. It's not all about what you can't do, and I think we've got to focus much more on the kind of society where you've got your lovely walks in the downs and so forth, and you're maybe able to spend more time with your family because you're not working a huge number of hours a week. Let's share the work around more sensibly so that everyone is working for fewer hours rather than an awful lot of people working a hell of a lot of hours and a lot of other people being unemployed. That could be sold in actually a very attractive way. You know, not many people go to their deathbeds thinking, my God, I wish I'd spent more time in the office. They're more likely to think, well, you know, looking back, maybe a bit more time with family and friends or doing what I like to do might have been a nicer way to spend life. So if we could talk a bit more about that, if we could talk a bit more about changes in public transport to make our public transport a proper 21st century, reliable, pleasant place to be in, instead of the kind of pretty miserable experience that so often is in this country. You know, what's not to like about an affordable, efficient public transport system? Or what's not to like about having properly insulated homes so that people aren't in the 21st century still dying from fuel poverty, literally from coldness, because they can't afford to keep their homes warm? You know, a street by street rolling out of home insulation will be one of the most effective ways, both of addressing our climate crisis, getting our emissions down, but also of creating hundreds of thousands of jobs. There's a fantastic little report that I commend to you that was written by the Campaign Against Climate Change together with a number of the unions, and it's called 1 Million Green Jobs. And it's all about the fact that the kind of society and economy that we're imagining is actually a very jobs-rich one, far more jobs-rich than the fossil fuel economy that it will replace. And so there will be plenty of work. There's no shortage of work to be done in a green economy. There's far more work. And that's the kind of investment that we need to see. There was a little example of Greens in Kirklees, where there were a couple of Greens on the council. They brought an idea to the council that was picked up by other councillors. And basically, it was about rolling out a programme of free insulation for 60,000 homes. And they've done exactly that over the past 3 years. And as a result, the emissions have come down. The average family has saved about £150 a year off their fuel bills, and over 100 jobs have been created. That's just a little microcosm of the kinds of thinking that we need to have, rather than what we're going to have from George Osborne on the 23rd of March, which is going to be all about indiscriminate growth, economic zones, let's just get more stuff, widgets and everything being produced, as if that, A, leads to anybody's happiness, and B, is actually compatible, as Andrew was saying, with a sustainable economy in a planet with finite resources. And so I guess I would simply conclude by saying that I think the challenge is partly about understanding all of this, but I think in a sense that's the easier bit. It's about how it then gets communicated, how we can paint this picture of a better, greener world that is attractive, that is more fair. And I guess probably later this afternoon you'll hear more from Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett about the spirit level. But lots of their work shows that actually in a greener world, it's more likely to be a much more equal world as well, that those two things go together very well. Because if we're not going to generate more and more growth through, if we're not going to generate more and more prosperity through growth, then we're going to have to do it through redistribution. And it brings that whole redistribution issue back onto the political agenda very, very importantly. We've got to get better about painting that greener world. So I think I'll leave it there.